welcome to our third conversation today, and there will be 13th conversation since yesterday. I'm Massimiliano Gioni, the artistic director of the new museum. I also forgot to mention that the video you see while you're sitting is Pipilotti Rist's contribution to these 2 days of conversation. She couldn't be here, and so she sent this very strange intermezzo or a screensaver that is meant to be played between conversations. So for any other conversation, if you're back, you'll see it playing before the conversation starts. I'm very happy and honored to be here with two great artists who I also have the pleasure of considering friends. I often joke that working on an exhibition. Yesterday, Ragnar Kjartansson said that going to his first retrospective was like he died and being in heaven surrounded by his works, which I think would make the curator Dr. Death. And I I often actually compare doing exhibitions, unfortunately, to divorces because it can be tough. But I'm very happy that I still managed to be friends with both Andra and Paul. And so I'm very grateful that they're both here. Paul McCarthy had his survey exhibition in 2001 at the New Museum, and Andra Ursuta had her exhibition, part of what we call our focus shows, in 2016. I'll start from Paul because New York, February to May 2001, the city was certainly very different from what it would have become a few months later. And on many levels, the art world and you yourself as an artist were in a very different place then, I think. I think it's significant that on the occasion of the show at the New Museum, which was in the Broadway location, you also displayed works at Deutsch Projects, the great garden installation, and at Lauren Augustine. So in a sense, your work was already too big to fit in our home, but your practice had not also become what it is now in sheer volume and maybe ambition. So I want to ask you, first of all, how do you remember that moment in time and how the invitation started to exhibit at the New Museum? Was it meant to be a survey? Was it meant to be a retrospective? And how you approached the exhibition?
I don't remember. You know, I think at that time I hadn't done something like that, and there were a number of pieces, and the scale of the pieces, like how to show them, and became more of an issue. And I think at the time, then like Jeffrey had that big space and sort of said, well, we can show the piece here. And then I think the show, you know, at one point went on to California, as I remember, went to Mocha at that point. So for me, it was somewhat of a turning point, you know, but I look back on it, you know, and a lot of those pieces, you know, I can't tell whether I have, like in a certain way, I've sort of distanced myself from them. And although the show I liked doing it, and I liked, it was important to me. In one way, it's like a lot of things, you see it and you think, wow, it could have been different. And so it was you know, it was the first time I think I got to do something like that, where I got to put up so many pieces and figure them out in a room, and figure them out in different floors, and figure them out in different buildings. And so the first time for that kind of experience, which then turned out to be something that's happened a lot after that. The whole thing of like museum shows and installation problems and scale problems, and how to push a curator and a director.
It's also hard to believe that that was your first New York museum show. And I am often reminded of the character in The Painter that says, I got big shows in Europe, I got big catalogs. And in a sense, up to that point, your reputation was maybe stronger in Europe for a certain type of institutional recognition. Or is that correct? Or you think, or it didn't even matter? I'm curious if you felt some sort of different endorsement because of the museum.
Because of that show?
Yeah.
I mean, I think beginning in, there was, in Los Angeles, there was, when Paul Schimmel did the Helter Skelter show, that was a real turning point for California in a way. You could look at it that way. And a number of the artists that were in that show began showing more in Europe, although there'd always been a situation of California artists going to Europe. And in my case, that was really true beginning in the 90s. I showed way more in Europe than I did in New York or California. California, it wasn't showing so much, and New York. So it was really 91, I showed in Europe. And after the show here and having a gallery in New York, I did show more in New York. But I mean, it's a strange one. I remember when I was showing in New York, during that period of time, if there was a review, it would often include pointing out that I was from California. And aging hippie, bad boy, all these kinds of comments. In one review, it referenced California 4 times, that I was from California. So there was this thing of like pointing out that I was from the outside. And, so yeah, Europe was what I showed.
One of the central pieces in the show was the Heidi House that you had made with McCarthy, which is not only at this point a legendary piece, but it's a piece that, strangely enough, confronts ideas of national belonging. No? And that's a theme that runs through your work and through Andra's work, and how the folkloric is a way to create a certain idea of nationalism or a certain idea of belonging. Do you feel that that is a recurring theme in your work?
I mean, I think that, the piece Heidi was, came, in the 70s, I was given an NEA grant, and at the time they had these exchange programs, and it was an exchange with France, and at that time is when I asked to do, I wanted to remake the story of Heidi in the French Alps in the 70s, and then I didn't get to do it. Anyway, they took the exchange, unless I just wanted a studio in Paris, the idea of making a project, they weren't going to allow it. But at that time, this, the whole thing of Disneyland, and there's a place in Los Angeles, Alpine Village, where there's like a German sort of mall where you could go and buy Lederhausen and cowbells and whatever, and this whole appropriation in California of Europe and this notion of cleanliness and purity. And so the subject of Heidi, was about, and it's sort of taking it back to Europe. And so we made the piece in Vienna, and Mike and I did. And Mike's part of it was, Mike was interested in Adolf Loos. So it was a kind of it was a schizophrenic building in which one side of it is Heidi and ornamentation, and the other side is Adolf Loos and the sick girl, and really a split in a way. And Mike sort of sided with the sick girl and Adolf Loos, and I was sort of Heidi and the goat and ornamentation. And So the piece was a collaboration in which we both had different sides of the actual structure of the building. The part of Adolf Loos was the American bar, so it was a combination. And then, you know, it sort of led to I think there was a whole interest in, at the time, and I was interested in I guess, making references to the patriarch and a sort of fascism coming out of in almost a stereotype and a cliche of German fascism, which then was referring back to Walt Disney. And at that time, I made a piece called A Straight Line from Adolf Hitler's Berlin to Walt Disney's Disneyland, in which I sort of collected photographs going from Berlin to Los Angeles, and photographs of, Adolf Hitler's cars in Vegas, and there's like, I think, 7 Eiffel Towers in Vegas, and Walt Disney with children, and Walt Disney with German shepherds, and Walt Disney with trains, and Adolf Hitler with children and German shepherds and trains. And so it's just this collection of trying to connect this idea of fascism back to America and the fascism of America.
Well, unfortunately, you were ahead of your time. I want to ask Andra, I'm actually from Italy, and I was born not far away from the Alps. And unfortunately, in both your works, the Alps are a site of dysfunction with Heidi. And Andra actually titled her exhibition here at the New Museum in 2016, The Alps. And it was, again, a kind of mountainous landscape where the mountains, though, were covered with penises, and the exhibition was populated by these figures you call whites that look like sort of Ku Klux Klan figures. Again, unfortunately, an example of a dark vision of the future that anticipated behaviors that now are sadly normal. But first of all, I want to ask you, what's the problem with the Alps? That clearly seems to, and I start wondering about my own origin. But, or on the other hand, also how in your own work you deal with the folkloric and different myths of origins.
So I was drawn to the Alps because I was watching a lot of mountain films, and that's why I decided to call the show that. But actually, my initial wish to make this kind of cock-covered climbing walls, I saw it more as a response to Duchamp's last sculpture, Étant Donné, and I thought I would try to make something really even more extravagant that is about my fantasies and the fear of my own fantasies. So it wasn't really so much a political comment or a comment on patriarchy, but I think thanks to Paul's work about Heidi, I think it's very hard to make a work that references the Alps and not read that content into it. Yeah.
So you wouldn't say it was a... It's interesting you mentioned that it wasn't about patriarchy, because that's what I thought. Well, it's...
No, I know it's...
But if you've seen the piece, I mean, obviously
it is. I think it's important to... I mean, I like to work with cliches a lot, but it's also kind of dangerous because a lot of times maybe the content is so strong in the work that it's very hard to inject your own content on top of that. So maybe with, if you're surrounded by kind of these overpowering towers covered with penises, it's hard not to feel oppressed in a way. I mean, for me, it was also like the attraction, but also the repulsion that made me want to try to make them into objects in the end.
There were 2 figures, though, also in the entrance, which depicted 2 women from I believe from France, who were being expelled, to Roma citizens who were being expelled. So there was also a narrative of nationality.
So I grew up in Romania, and I did not grow up with art. So when I started to make art, I felt like it was my obligation to deal with and explain where I was from and what the issues were and kind of work through them a little bit so that I can then make kind of art that claims to be international or an international, deals with international issues. I felt like it was because of kind of this underdog status that Romanians had, and when I was growing up, that it was not allowed somehow, or it was not okay for me to just go full on for, like I couldn't have just made minimalist sculptures. I had to explain why I was here, and so in that process, I made some works that have to do with value and the value of people in different contexts and the value of artworks. And I made these works about witches during the time of Occupy Wall Street, because I read this article about Romania where these witches put a curse on the government because the government made witchcraft a legitimate profession in order to be able to tax them. And they got together, put a curse with a dead cat, and then the government collapsed. And of course,
we need them in Washington as soon as possible.
Governments collapse over there very frequently, and but I kind of departed from this idea that what if this curse had actually worked, and this is it's so much more fun and such an effective way to like try to cause political change than to protest on the street. So then I started to make these monuments to these women. It was a bit like a fictional cult, personality cult that would have developed in the future when these witches became the president. So that's how those works came to be.
You both mentioned the idea of the cliche and the stereotype. That is something that your work engages with and assaults in a sense. And the other side of that is the taboo, the nudity and excess of some kind. So and also you mentioned the figure of the witch. That is a stereotype that is often recurring in Paul's literature about his work, how he performs the role of the shaman. And I'm not really even convinced of that reading. But so I want to ask you, first of all, if you ever felt as an artist, Paul, that you were somehow performing, if not the role of the witch, but the role of some sort of medicine doctor, and on the other hand, also how you approach taboos and stereotypes in your work. It's a big question, but
I never saw myself in any form as a shaman. In fact, almost pushed that away, and I did see myself more as a clown in a certain way. And I guess you could say, well, there's such things as, there's a discussion around things like sacred clown and all that, but really more like a clown of some sort. And the whole thing of reversing and turning upside down, and that suited what I was doing. And riding a horse backwards and sitting on the saddle backwards seemed to fit more about what I was doing than the idea of being something between two worlds, and I never in a way saw myself as curing anything, myself or culture. So I really wasn't. I mean, I see it was a term used a lot, I think, with European artists at one point, boys, and to some degree, maybe even with like Hermann Nietzsche and all this. But I sort of didn't see it that way. I didn't even think like that, you know.
Well, the element that neutralized the reading is the use of the grotesque and humor, now in both of your works. I think it's key to understanding that even when you are acting perhaps like a shaman or playing with the role of the witch, there is an element of grotesquerie and carnivalesque. Maybe that's a more crucial reference, no? And then also in your case, Andra, is maybe even specific to certain, again, stereotypes or myths around certain areas of Europe, no? The idea of the peasant, the idea of rural culture that you often play with.
I come from a long line of peasants, so I think that it's important to acknowledge them as many times as I can. I also would like to be a sort of a clown in my work, but I think, and not to complain about being a woman, but I think it's a bit more difficult maybe because I don't know, it's a bit more grotesque maybe to see a woman fail in these comical ways in the work and use their body in this way. But so I think that a lot of works that I made, especially in the beginnings, were more about wishing to be this kind of like, you know, clown, bad boy, but failing. And then the failure became a different kind of, became the work something that's in between comedy and kind of a disaster.
And there has been a lot of slapstick in your early work, particularly now, Paul, in your early videos and performances, like, you know, the face paint and so on, were there, which I think maybe resonates more with the film culture simply because they were made in California. Did you feel a direct relationship to that tradition of the comedy films and the slapstick? Or, you know, earlier Jeremy Deller was saying that for him watching Vito Acconci immediately makes him think of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin more than some heroic figure.
I mean, at times I've said that, you know, the difference between my work and the Viennese actionism, I grew up with television and ketchup, and they grew up with World War II and Catholicism. And
I don't know who was better placed.
But I don't, you know, on the other hand, you know, it's sort of a way to divert the probe or something. And I don't actually know. I know growing up, I you know, it's no big deal, but I was dyslexic. So one way to survive in school was to be a comedian and to you know, be accepted within the peers or whatever. And I think that, you know, rather than looking at, you know, I mean, sure, Andy Kaufman or whatever, or, you know, there were all these kind of comedians I was interested in, I guess, during that period of time. But I think more than that world of, you know, the direct world of comedy and television and Buster Keaton and all that, I don't think that was so critical to me. I think what, you know, the discovery of Kudo in 1966 or Yves Klein was more critical, and than just being myself. So I don't know whether the presence of a kind of other way of making. I mean, like, I think you know, a lot of the early performances in the 60s and that came not so much out of a direct influence, but, you know, I one time ran down a hill and with 3 friends, and I used this thing where we had a race down a hill, and it was a sand hill, and I didn't realize the hill was getting steeper, and I didn't really I didn't really think it out what that meant. And at one point I was winning the race only because the one fell down and the other one realized you can't run down a steep hill like that. And so it was a fumbling mistake where I ended up crashing at the bottom. But at that point I had just, it was in 66 or something, I just realized I'd never seen a photograph of Yves Klein leap, but I remember that being a piece or a work of art. Not that I understood it as sculpture, and I didn't at that point understand it as sculpture, but I think the mistake of falling on this hill like really sent a light bulb that like, wow, I'd kind of gone through life like this, way of fumbling. And when I painted the black paintings with my hands, it wasn't a comment or because of Jackson Pollock. It was just the fastest way to put black paint on the surface. And when I burned them, it wasn't because of Yves Klein. It was, again, the quickest way to turn them black. But the references to Capro or to Kudo or to Fluxus made me see it in another way. So burning the paintings all of a sudden made sense, and the painting on the ground made sense as an architectural, like the square we're sitting on. It all of a sudden, things came together that way, but, I'm not sure. So art and just making work and making one step further into making an object or doing something is a lot about how those two things came together, and it made it visible as to what something could be, what a language could be. It was a discovery of a language, the language of the body and the language of time and the language of space, and the breaking down of the conventions of painting. It broke down all the conventions by seeing that, burning a painting, that's an action. An action can be a sculpture.
This makes me want to ask both of you a question about actually the artist working, let's say in solitude. I think nowadays it's impossible to think that you were making that work and many others, also the early performances and videos, and they weren't made for an exhibition. No? Nowadays, the system is very much a delivery system to an occasion of exhibition or exhibitionism, in a sense. So I want to ask you, Paul, how that happened. How did you make work in solitude, if it was in solitude or if it was for a small audience? In the last few years, you have also done a lot of work to present the work of other artists, or anyway acknowledge the community that was around you through exhibitions or through the gallery, the box. So on one hand, I wanted to ask you how that early work was made, and to Andra, if you had a similar experience, or if for a younger artist nowadays, the procedure of putting work out there is substantially different. So do you only make work for the purpose of exhibition, or have you been through a phase also in which you were making work for yourself or in isolation? Or so I don't know who the two wants to start.
Well, I've never made work as an old artist, so I don't know another way to. I do feel that too much is, or it's expected for artists to produce constantly new work right now, and maybe this is something that was not the case when you were starting out. I did not go to art school. I went to normal university, and I did not go to graduate school, and I didn't think that I would ever make it as an artist in any way. So I just made work in my apartment for I think 7 years, and nobody, I didn't show it to anybody. I didn't know anybody in the art world, and it just seemed like this completely impenetrable thing, I wouldn't even have known how to enter it. And so I think in a way that was the most valuable time I ever spent developing as an artist, because there were no pressures at all, and I wished that I could recreate that somehow, but it's impossible now because everything is so much more professionalized. And yeah.
Well, I think, you know, first being in Salt Lake City, Utah, and making work there, and then moving to San Francisco, and then to LA and all that. And during the period between the mid-'60s and maybe the late '70s, I think there was something about making work kind of within, I don't know, there was an eye towards what might be thought of as the art world at the time. You know, there wasn't I didn't have an eye at all towards a gallery. That just didn't even cross my mind until I think probably mid to late '70s. But there were alternative spaces in the early '70s, and LA had them, Leica and Lace and all these places. But and I did a show or two in these spaces or in San Francisco, and I don't think I ever did a project in New York in an alternative space, or maybe I did it. But there was something about just making work, and work in relationship to friends, or work in relationship to myself, but with some sort of idea about an art world, you know, like that it was there, mostly through books or museums or something. But I never really. And then, of course, LA, there was not really the kind of art world there is today. And I didn't sell a work of art until '91 or '92, so got out of school in the early '70s, so that's 20 years that the idea of selling work just was not on my radar at all. And consequently, a lot of work was thrown away. As I moved, we would throw it away. And it wasn't as much of a situation. It really happened more like, I remember in the late '70s, early '80s, you began to see it with people I knew, you know, I think. There were artists that had, you know, I think Burden was showing, and you know, Mike and all those, that's another generation. But the California, you know, Nauman, of course, but it wasn't a situation. Now, you know, by the time you hit the '80s, but I didn't sell to a museum probably until 2000 or something. So it wasn't a massive change, you know, for me in the mid '90s, you know. And so I was part of a '60s, '70s sort of notion of making art, and then also the idea of non-commodity, and you know, was so much a part of the alternative notion of art, and Fluxus and Capro and Boris Lurie and all of this, you know.
Did you have anybody that served as your ideal audience, or you know, the art history teaches, you know, that Braque and Picasso gave each other license to do what they were doing, or Rauschenberg and Jones, you know, these ideas that sometimes even a microscopic audience of ones allows you to do what you're doing, or is there for you to confront, and were there artists that you felt closer to, or that were the ones that gave you license and permission to do what you were doing?
Well, yeah, there was a community, you know, of performance artists in California, and I knew a lot of them, and you know, you could do a performance in a university, you could do a performance just in a studio or something like that. But I knew that, and there was a whole thing about the school system in California, Cal Arts and Irvine, those were the two, and Capro coming to Cal Arts, and then the Fluxus coming to Cal Arts, Dick Higgins and Allison Knowles, and then you had the musicians, and Namjoon Pike and Charlemagne Palestine and Simone Forti, they were all there. And Cal Arts was a real, and it was very influential to the future of California, because in California, I think because of Cal Arts, the idea of an artist teaching really came, I think, out of Cal Arts. And so the next generation I was part of, a lot of people taught, almost everybody taught. And then that filtered into the schools of UCLA and USC and Art Center and all that. All these people coming out of Cal Arts or Irvine moved into teaching. So the schools were, you know, I remember at one point in the 90s, it became really a thing. If European galleries came, they always wanted to go to the schools. And it was kind of a sad one, because the population of mid-career artists in California was huge, you know, like.
That's when.
So like, but then, you know, like as somebody coming to California, how are they gonna go see people who are spread out over miles? So they would go to the schools. So you know, like a lot of young artists, if they didn't make it in their last year of college to get a show in Europe, harder to get one now, because nobody can find you once you're in that, you know, that soup bowl, you know. So
that's when Baldessari referred to the submerging artists. No?
Yeah.
The emerging artists got a lot of attention,
yeah.
and then in the 40s or 50s, you become a submerging artist because nobody really can find you or care. Or
you know, the other thing is that you know, the idea of showing other people's work or doing that was very much part of the 70s. So this idea of you know, organizing alternative spaces, or you know, magazines or radio programs in the 70s. I mean, I've sort of continued that. That all started back then, of artists showing artists, and as opposed to the idea of a gallery telling you whether you could have a show. I think that was, I've always been interested in the idea of that artists form their own venues, you know.
And Andra, this is a recurring conversation today about New York and Manhattan in particular, that it's more sterile as an environment, sanitized and gentrified, etc. You came to New York, I think, around the same time I came. I don't know when exactly.
99, 2000.
Yeah, 2099. Did you find a nurturing community for what you wanted to do? Can I say also, in full disclosure, Andra was a member of the Gogo Bordello, which was a what was it, a folk punk band or
gypsy punk band.
A gypsy punk band. I just mentioned it because
that
it happened that we were in
environment, but
no, not a nurturing environment. But so I'm asking also if do you feel that you didn't have that experience in New York of finding your own audience or your own community, or is still possible?
I don't think I ever found the community, but maybe this is more of a like, I don't want to psychologically profile myself in front of you, but I think maybe just because of the way I am, I always worked alone, and I never was able to find a group of people that I worked with until I started to show with Ramic and Crucible, which was much later, just 2010. I think that it's so hard to consider yourself as being part of any sort of movement right now. It feels like everybody's just like a movement of one, and I don't know if that's only the case in New York. I think it's everywhere.
Well, speaking of movement of one. Both of you have cast yourself, not metaphorically, but your own bodies, and I find that, I mean, first of all, it's a huge question and problem within the history of modern art and contemporary art in particular, but it's also the type of work I very much connect to in physically, not only intellectually. And I'm curious about how that process develops when you start, for example, how many, well, there is the one cast of yourself, but you've done a couple of others, self-portraits, and how did they develop? And many other works of yours are some sort of self-portrait, like the small dioramas. And
so I think that actually maybe it came out of not having a community of people that I could ask to be the models for my works. That's why I ended up using just myself. It's very hard to cast yourself by yourself. I had a lot of problems with that.
Did you do it, or you had help?
Yeah, no, I did it all myself. I think it also came from just this original idea or desire to be like Buster Keaton, or to be this like kind of tragic hero that is always like failing, and somehow that hurts or distorts the body in these ways that are very caricaturesque, but they actually mask real injuries somehow. So I wanted to make this sculpture that was a self-portrait as a bog body, which was very flattened, and that really came out of wanting to make something like a cartoon, like a way a cartoon character would get smashed, and then it's just creating these hybrids between a naturalistic representation and this cartoonish outcomes. So that's where the body casts come from for me.
And what about you, Paul? Did you cast first? I know this question sounds weird and a little creepy, but did you cast first yourself before you made cast of other people, or how did the casting process work in your own work?
Well, I know that I to a degree stopped doing public performances, but it's not really true. To some degree stopped in the early 80s, I guess. And I remember there was a quote by Vito Acconci of wanting to make a piece to replace himself in a performance, and I had really been interested in, I guess I kind of wanted that quote, but also Abraham Lincoln in Disneyland, and wanting to make a robotic figure, or wanting to make a wax figure or something, and kind of going from the live body to a sculptural form. And so I started by trying to mold part of myself, like the torso area. And then I made the mold and cast and all this stuff, and then became interested in the mold and the molding, like the cast, the mold, inside the mold was a quite detailed representation of myself or something, right? And then there was the whole thing of, in Hollywood, of the dummy and the prosthetic and the appliance all used in film. And so the first real life cast I made of myself was meant to be in a film. I was going to, it was a dummy in a full representation where a kind of trick, and I was going to cut it all up. And in a sort of type of odd horror film, and I didn't do it. It actually, what's strange was it actually really kind of disturbed me, and I was a little surprised by it, that like an exact image of myself lying there dead was a bit like a little, I didn't know how to exactly deal with it. And so it sat in the studio, and then one day I put it on a beach chair, which seemed to really help. And then it sat there on a beach chair for a while. Then it was a nude body, and people would walk by it. And then I started saying it wasn't me dead, it was me dreaming that I was asleep. And then I put a shirt on it, and then it was completely okay. And then I put socks on it, and so it was nude from the sort of waist down and with socks on. And so there was this thing of getting over it and seeing it as a buffoon. I was always sort of interested in this idea of the buffoon. But you know, after that, I made a lot of life casts of myself and a lot of life casts of bodies, I just sort of finished this 2-year thing of 65 days of filming, and I think I made 15 live casts, and it was all for the purpose of shooting the film. But of course, I see them all as sculptural objects. I mean, my whole relationship to Hollywood and to sets is, I see them as metaphors for a sort of perception of what is going on for me, how I see the world. And so the set or the prosthetic or the appliance, they're all within a physical language. And it's what is unseen or behind the, you know, it's too simplistic to refer to it as what's behind the scene. But it's not that I'm that interested in showing what's behind the scenes so you see what makes the image that Hollywood makes. It's actually, I'm interested in what's behind the scene because I actually think it says something. And that you can then reform what's behind the scenes. So my interest in these objects that get often used in film, in the film world, for me, I'm not interested in explaining what is behind the scene. I'm interested that they actually are a form of language to say something. And so, you know, so the live casts and all that.
You know, to play with words, you're interested literally in the obscene, knowing what is outside the scene. And it always struck me that in Hollywood, people talk about casting as choosing actors, and which is in a sense another use of the mask. You mentioned your most recent project, and maybe since we are exactly at the end of the talk right now, but if you both want to talk about what you're currently working on, or so you mentioned this film, can you say a little more, or you literally finished yesterday? No?
I don't think it's done, but it's been going on for a couple of years, and it was really an interest. I had a long interest in I guess, the West, and making a type of Western. You know, it's been for like 15 years or 20 years, but so it started off as one group of people, and maybe it's a lot about people in a landscape and then people in an architecture. And then, when I wrote it, it was about 3 stages of violence. One stage, all of it being about mediation of violence, I think, where that's most of my, you know, from television or the news of violence. So one was a stage of bullying, one was a stage in which men kill people, men being males, and the other one is cross violence, in which everybody kills everybody. So the last phase of it is in an architecture, which is a saloon, but based on a saloon from Fassbinder's Whitey. And so I recreated the saloon, and in there, 14 people over a period of 20 or 30 days just kill each other over and over again.
Andra, you want to top that?
ISIS. That's what
yeah, that's true. Yes, you're making work about ISIS. Well, you want to say more, or joyful times. So thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.